All right, so we've spent some time looking so far in this course at wisdom literature, right, in its ancient Near Eastern context and its relationship to the Pentateuch. We spent some time looking at the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Proverbs, and discussing how that book uses poetic language to expand upon the ordinary language that we find in the Pentateuch, all dealing with this idea of covenant stipulations and how God's people are to fulfill those covenant stipulations and what is at stake in those things. Okay, now we're going to move on to the book of Ecclesiastes, a book that I think has an enormous amount of things to say to people today. And in this book, the most important thing, in my opinion, is understanding this word hevel, or what's translated in a lot of translations as vanity or meaningless, something along those lines. If you've done the reading, you know that there are several options for this small word. Now, what I propose is that this term, hevel, is a reference back to the very first time in the Bible that we find out that this relationship between actions and consequences is broken, right? It doesn't work the way that we expect it to always. Sometimes it does, but not always, right? And the reason I think that is because this word hevel is the exact same word as Abel. Okay, so this person Abel in the Cain and Abel narrative, he is the very first instance of this breakdown of the retribution principle. Remember, in the covenant that God makes with his people, he says, look, do this and live. Keep these covenant stipulations in order to receive, and God will bless you with these blessings. If you do not keep these covenant stipulations, you will receive curses. Okay, now, so we have that kind of in the background. Now let's go all the way back to the book of Genesis, okay? In the book of Ecclesiastes, in several places, it uses language and themes that are reminiscent of the book of Genesis, okay? So we have the garden building project in Ecclesiastes. We have the reference to humans being created out of dust, right? We have the reference to returning to the dust, okay? That reminds us of the book of Genesis. If we're good Hebrew readers, our bells are going off in our minds thinking, man, something is going on here. And then on top of that, this word hevel, used 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, first appears in the book of Genesis as the name of Abel, the very first person who experiences the breakdown between actions and their consequences. Okay, so we go back to the book of Genesis, and we have Adam and Eve committing their sin, right? Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as a result of that, they receive the curse, right? So the work is cursed, the ground is cursed, the serpent is cursed, Eve is cursed, right? We have all of these things, the curses that result from the failure to obey the suzerain, Yahweh, okay? Now, they're kicked out of the garden. Fast forward, Cain and Abel are born, right? You remember Cain. He is the farmer who brings an offering to the Lord, okay? And the Bible says that he just brings some of his produce to the Lord. Abel, on the other hand, is righteous, right? He brings the very best of his produce, or of his flocks, right? He's a shepherd. He brings the very best. And remember what happens. Cain kills Abel. Abel was righteous. He should have experienced, based on what we know about this covenant and the covenant stipulations and the blessings associated with it, Abel should have experienced long life, lots of children, financial prosperity, right? He should have experienced material wealth, all of these things, and instead, he's murdered. And what does Cain experience? Cain gets a mark of protection from Yahweh. He goes on to found a city, live a long life, have children and wives, and potentially wealth, right? Because he has the city. He receives the fruits of righteousness, right? And Abel receives the fruits of wickedness, a short life, okay? So that's this first instance of the failure, the breakdown of this retribution principle. And Ecclesiastes is using that story as in the background to label all of these various situations hevel, okay, Abel. All of these things are Abel-like in some sense. He talks about how life is Abel-like. It's brief, it's fleeting, right? Just like Abel died too young. Um, Kohelet or Ecclesiastes talks about how sometimes the fastest runner doesn't win the race, right? There's a breakdown between what you expect and what happens. He says that in the place of righteousness, there's wicked. And in the place of justice, there's injustice, okay? Where you expect one thing, another thing happens. He says that one of the greatest things, one of the greatest hevels or Abel-like situations is when the wicked prolong their days in their wickedness, and the righteous person's life is cut short. Right? When the fate of the wicked happens to the righteous, and the fate of the righteous happens to the wicked. So he's not saying that all these things are meaningless. He's not using this term hevel in the sense of vanity or meaninglessness. He's using it in the sense of, look, something has gone wrong. There is the world, the life that we live is covered in all of this ableness, all of this Abel-like situations. And so the book of Ecclesiastes is an honest attempt to deal with the frustration and the longing that happens when we, as members of this covenant with Yahweh, expect things to happen one way, and yet they happen another way. Okay? So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about what Ecclesiastes says we should do about that. But in this lesson, I just want to highlight the fact that it's not vanity, it's not meaningless that Ecclesiastes is talking about. He's talking about the breakdown between what we expect to happen and what actually happens. Sometimes the wicked prosper. Sometimes the righteous are killed. And we see that right from the very beginning of the book of Genesis. And that is what Ecclesiastes is wrestling with and struggling with.